Hey everybody, Nick here, and today we're going to do a little disassembly and maintenance on these two knives right here. I'm going to do these together because basically I'm going to do the same thing for both of them, so there's not a whole lot of point in making two separate individual videos. I'll just make this video, label them both, and then add this, and then just review the two knives right next to each other, because there's a nice little contrast here. But anyways, both of these knives can be disassembled in the exact same way. Now, there are two ways to take apart any Benchmade Axis Lock knife. The first one is to go remove the pivot, remove these screws, remove these screws, remove these screws, take the entire thing apart, separating the wood from the scale, removing the omega spring. Look, that's absolutely possible, and if you're in a situation where, for instance, you were to get a bunch of salt water up behind there, you can do that. If you're interested in taking that approach, check out my disassembly of the Benchmade Valet, where I do that, and you see the full pain of a complete Axis Lock disassembly. It's just not a great approach, and the thing is, most of the time you don't need to do it. And so instead, you can take this second technique that I'm going to demonstrate here today, where you basically treat the handle as a piece that you don't need to worry about, and disassemble the blade and the washers, which are the places you need to service, and service them separately. So I want to start off in this technique by removing the pivot screw. So I've removed the pivot screw, case freaking closed. Now I'm going to move this guy slightly off camera. Now at this point we have a pivotless, we don't have a pivot screw in the top there, and so what I can do is I'm going to pull back on the Axis Lock just a little bit, watch this, and then I'm just going to use a little, in this case it's a watch spring bar tool, but I'm going to use that and just watch. Pop the pivot right out of there. Case closed. Pivot is out of there. Now at this point in time, the blade is free and the washers are free, and the knife is basically disassembled to the point where I need it. Remaining inside the handle here is the Axis Lock unit itself, which is fine. It doesn't really need to move much. In fact, the less you mess around with the little omega springs, the better, because they're unfortunately a little bit on the fragile side. But if you want to clean the knife out at this point, one approach that you can use is to put a little bit of rubbing alcohol or something on the on a little Q-tip, or wrap a little cloth or paper towel around something, and then just get in there and kind of wipe, and you can just wipe all the way through. And you can see nicely here the skeletonization. You can kind of clean things out, whatnot. But really, this part of the knife, by and large, takes care of itself. The part that's going to accumulate gunk and dirt and whatnot is this area here. Now, mind you, this knife is actually very, very clean because I recently cleaned it. I've been carrying this guy a little bit for review, and so I did a quick cleanup at one point, actually live on the Instagram, and nonetheless, so I'll just show you basically how it works here. I'm going to use a little bit of lubrication here, and that's maybe a little bit much, but actually in this case, I want a fair amount of lubrication. So I've gone ahead and I've made a blade sandwich here. Basically, you can put the washer on both sides here, and you're going to use a little bit of lubrication to hold the washers onto both sides. So there we go. Put that through there. Now, next step. Leave this whole unit. I'm assuming that you would have already cleaned the blade, wiped everything off, wiped off the washers, because that's really all you're going to have to do. And just use some rubbing alcohol, something like that. Again, this guy's clean. In fact, I'll show you the full version on this guy. Next step is going to be to take the pivot. The pivot itself has a little bit of a D shape to it. You can see here, and so you're going to need to figure out which side of this pivot actually has, on the inside there, where is the little flat portion. In this case, it seems to be pointing in this general direction, down towards the bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and insert the pivot there. And now, very carefully, I'm going to look inside here, and you can see now the pivot is sticking too far out. I don't want that. I, in fact, want the pivot as close to flush as I can get it. So now, here's the next step, and this is the only really tricky part of this. I've made myself a blade sandwich. I'm holding the washers roughly in position where I need them to be. Now what I'm going to do is, with the blade sandwich, pull back on the Axis Lock. So pulling back on the Axis Lock is important because the blade can't move into position fully with the Axis Lock engaged. So I pull back on the Axis Lock. Now what I'm going to try and do here is just apply a little bit of pressure to the pivot itself, pushing in from the back side here, with my goal being to kind of snag that washer. There we go. Actually, I got both steps at a time. I'm lucky. So what happened there is the washer as well as the blade itself aligned. And so at that moment, the pivot could push all the rest of the way through. Now at this point, I can let go of the Axis Lock because the blade is in position. And now I'll do my final little step. I'm going to use, again, a little tiny tool here. I'm just going to pop this guy over a little bit while applying pressure to the back to the pivot, with the idea that once I have this perfectly aligned, and maybe There you go. Once I pull that back a little bit, the pivot will pop the rest of the way into place. And at that point in time, the knife is disassembled and then almost reassembled. The last step is going to be to reinsert the screw here. And at this point, I'm going to use a little bit of blue Loctite here. I'm using the Loctite on a stick at the moment. It works nicely. Then I'm just going to insert that guy right into the Axis lock, or I'm sorry, right into the pivot hole. Case closed. Now, tuning this action is going to be a slightly different affair because Benchmade, you know, sometimes you'll be able to get it perfect, where you have no blade play, perfect centering, all those kinds of things. That's great when it happens. It doesn't always happen. But what I'm trying to do here is get it to a place where there is no side-to-side play, where if I do this, there's no waggle. And right now, that's where I'm at. I also want it to be relatively free swinging. And right now, it's kind of there. I'd like to see, though, if I can back it off a little bit. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to back this screw off just a smidge. Pop it out again. At this point in time, it is pretty damn free swinging if I can do it properly without hitting the phone, which is recording this. And actually, there's no play. So right here, this is the perfect area. There is no play, and it swings very freely. That means I got a good one. Thank you, Benchmade, for making this as a good one. And so that's nice. Then the final step here for an Axis lock is going to be to do a little bit of oil on the top. And I'm going to use a thicker oil here. That's not truly necessary. If you have any oil, it'll work. But the thicker oil stays in place a little better. And I'm just going to apply a little bit to the blade tang. And this will apply itself over time to the Axis lock bar, etc. And just make the whole thing a little bit smoother, particularly on the deploy, because it just slides on a lubricated path rather than otherwise. And now this knife is absolutely perfectly ready to go. Now what we're going to do is do the other one, but at speed. Well, at least I'm going to just try and pretend that this is the kind of speed I could do on a normal basis. That's, of course, pretending that I was a brilliant man. And as we're doing this, there we go. Nice. So that's got a pivot collar, but it's really no different. The fundamental setup is the same as on your little your North Fork down there. All it is just a pivot. And so I'm going to go ahead and pull back on the Axis lock a little bit here. There we go. And now just pop the pivot right out. Come on, you little bugger. There we go. Hey, pivot all the way through. Okay, pull the blade. At this point, I have got myself a little washer, blade. There we go. Grab some booze. This is 91% rubbing alcohol. Put it on a cloth. Clean the washer. Again, this one isn't dirty particularly. It's damn near factory fresh. Only carried a couple of days. Going to carry it a little bit more before the review. Then I'll go ahead and get through here. Get in here, that is. And just try and clean out this area. If nothing else, to remove any factory lubrication. Although, as I recall, both of these knives didn't come lubed from the factory. So just kind of getting that out of there. And then I'll just get in here. There we go. A little bit of gunk, but nothing too bad. Go ahead and clean out. Oh, I don't think I showed this off in the other one, but you're going to want to hit the inside of the blade pivot as well. It's a useful thing. Now we are basically cleaned up here. Washers are in good shape. A little bit of oil here. Again, using more oil than usual because I want to make sure that these washers want to stay attached. Basically, a little tiny bit on the outside here. There we go. Now, next step is going to be to pop the pivot out here. I believe... No, the show side here is the one where the pivot goes in. Again, there's a D-shaped pivot, and again, if we look closely, it's on the top there, where the issue is, oh, clean off the pivot. Forgot about that. Details, details. And again, just a little bit of lubrication. There we go. So, pivot goes in from this side on this guy. Again, making sure it's roughly even. And let's see if we can repeat the magic. In this case, it's a little bit awkward because I'm going to be applying Axis lock pressure with that. Ah, damn it, the pivot started going back in there. Let's see here. This pivot's moving more freely, so that's going to make my life more difficult. But that's okay. Okay. First step, pull back on the Axis lock. There we go. next step, I'm going to apply pressure to the pivot as I pull the axis lock back. And I want to see if I can at least grab a washer. Ah, I cannot. All right, we're going to try a slightly different tack. This one may work a little bit better sometimes. It's just you're going to limit the degrees of freedom basically by 1. So what we're going to do is we're going to pop the pivot out here, and then we're going to put it part of the way in, and then we're going to go ahead and snag one of the washers with the pivot to start with. You may need to use a little tool. Ah, come on. It's easy. It's straightforward, he says. No, he's a jackass. There we go. So, there's the pivot. Drop the washer on there. Come on. Just trying to get that washer around the pivot. Okay, good. So I got a washer around the pivot. That's nice. That means that the only next thing I need to do here is to get the blade onto the pivot. To do that, I'm going to need to, again, manipulate this. This is one of those many, many occasions on which I truly and well wish I were an octopus. Okay, there we go. Pivot is now partly speared through there. The blade is in, but unfortunately the washer is not. See, in a way, it's good that you see this extra complexity. I'm going to use this business card over here and just kind of pop this through. Just trying to push this washer into its position where it wants to naturally be. Okay, maybe I need something a little bit stiffer, whatever. I can just drag it through the rest of the way here. Whoa there! Not a brilliant move. So what did I do wrong? I had the blade deployed and the axis lock unlocked as a process of doing this. There we go. It's the rest of the way through. But guys, that was really stupid of me. You need to learn from that. Luckily, I didn't get cut because luckily this guy, it's sharpish, I guess. But still, that was a really dumb move, and that could have been a cut on the finger. This is a good reason. In fact, see, I'm always torn between displaying my idiocy proudly for the entire internet to see and trying to cover it up, reshooting and whatnot. But the thing is, this is a good argument for going ahead and masking off your blade before you do these kinds of things. You know, it's something I should do. It's something I don't do. It's because I'm, well, not lazy. Yeah, lazy. Let's be real here. And not brilliant. So, that's not great. But hey, whatever. It worked out okay this time. But you got to be careful. So, okay. Now we're back to the tuning phase. Right now we got blade play. That means we need to tighten this down a little bit further. Tightening down. We do not have blade play. Do we have an action? We do have an action. We continue. No, we got a little blade play now. Let's tighten it a little bit more. And we have an action. Ish. Let's see if we can dial that in a little better. No play. Little micro skosh that direction. There we go. No play. All right, we're dialed in. Beautiful. Second good one. Thank you again there, Benchmade. So, okay, what have we learned? A couple of things. First off, that you can disassemble these Axis Lock Benchmates in one of two ways. There is the painful way that involves every damn screw on the knife, as well as trying to wrangle an Axis Lock bar back into place. And there is the more straightforward way I just showed you, where you're just using the pivot to spear the blade and whatnot, treating it like an integral knife. In most situations, what I just did works fine. Next thing, we learned that it's probably a good idea to mask the blade of the knife. In this case, I didn't hurt myself, and I probably should. I probably should do that in the future. Probably won't, because, again, lazy and not brilliant. But nonetheless, again, just put a little bit of oil on there. Case closed, problem solved. And then finally we learned how to tune these guys, or at least we saw it again. So 15 minutes, not bad for two Benchmade Axis Lock knives, but that's because I cheated and did the easy thing instead. And the lazy thing, which almost cost me a finger. Learn from me. Anyways, hope this has been interesting to you guys, and gals for that matter, and that you have yourselves an absolutely wonderful rest of the day, and that you're way smarter than I just was. Bye now.